Hello, welcome back to Souljourner. Angelo Rosso here with.
Noah Tembrook.
Hello, Noah. Nice to be with you again, my friend.
Hey, hey, good to be here.
Yes, yes, yes. So today, yeah, we were riffing a little bit a couple weeks ago, as we do, preparing our next theme to be explored. And we came to this idea today of talking about the baby boomer generation, hence the title of this pod, All Roads Lead to the Baby Boomers. We just found ourselves having a conversation around some very topical issues at the moment, and how almost every single issue that we were discussing somehow led back to this infamous generation. So we're going to talk a little bit today about this baby boomer generation, maybe for folks who are not familiar with this generation, we'll maybe go into a little bit about that and speak more broadly about issues regarding the political landscape here in Canada and the US, housing crisis, really, in many ways, in Canada and the US, immigration, aging population, and other aspects related to what's happening in our current climate. So, yeah, Noah, maybe you want to riff a little bit and share what comes to your mind as we explore this idea of the all roads lead to baby boomers.
Yeah, thanks, Angelo. Um, this was definitely going to be a touchy subject for me because, both of our parents are baby boomers and we love them dearly and we certainly have had a strong influence, positive and negative, from the baby boomer generation. So it's sort of a bittersweet topic. And definitely one worth perusing and sharing about, considering just how foundational to our realities the baby boomer generation has been. Just to give a little bit of context for those tuning in, just to get specific on the year uh, that we're discussing, baby boomers were generally considered born between 1946 and 1965. And so and they were considered the largest generation uh, to appear on the planet. And they've since then, they were born into a post-war era after Vietnam, and since then enjoyed to a large extent a time where there was uninterrupted prosperity, a lack of uh, major conflict. And pardon me, I have to go back. I think I made an error there. They weren't born after Vietnam, after World War II. Sorry,
That's right. Yeah. Nice. No, no, you got it. Well done.
I got that catch there. Sorry about that. And essentially, from a superficial read would say that they've had a pretty remarkable rise in this era from the 1960s through the current day, consolidating power in Washington in 1995 and essentially being the dominant voice in politics and uh, pretty much everything since then. Am I missing anything?
No, it's good. No, it's very good. Um, yeah, I thank you so much for your little caveat there. Absolutely. We are two fellows talking. We are certainly not experts on this subject, or by no means trying to exemplify all of the analytical research on this generation. We're simply having a conversation, trying to understand from our perspectives why we both, I can say, have a very, like, as you said, bittersweet relationship with this generation. And I think many people do. This is not unique to us. I've spoken to a lot of people. I guess I can consider myself maybe on the cusp between like millennial and Gen X generation. And this generation, specifically the boomers, is like this is they're just like hanging over a lot of the conversation currently. So we thought it'd be fun to kind of dig into as to why that's been the case. And we've also spoken about how our own struggles in our lives with certain institutions, certain organizations that we've been involved in that are heavily represented, led, and run by folks that are, 65 plus, let's just say. and are very tethered to that generation and to some of the values of that generation that, for better or worse, are kind of aging out and becoming a little bit obsolete and dusty. But I think there's a huge cohort there that wants to hold on and hang on to values that came perhaps out of that 60s, the famous 60s movement, that I don't feel for younger folks that I work with and talk to don't feel as relevant to kids and people that are, 15 and younger, especially. Um, yeah, so that's what I wanted to add also to what you just offered.
Great caveat, absolutely. And yeah, we're just ranting really, and definitely not an expert on the issue, but I can see the loose connections, and I feel like it's important to discuss as we move forward and try to understand the times that we're in.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll bring it to perhaps more local issues to start us off, and then I'd love to hear your reflection from the other side of the border. So I'm here in Canada, Pacific Northwest, and we just had an election, and we elected a new prime minister, a baby boomer prime minister, and a liberal prime minister. And for many folks, if you asked 3, 4 months ago if the Liberals were going to win the election, they would probably have said no. But a lot has happened over the past few months. And what was more, I would say, an election based upon cost of living and the housing crisis and crime and inflation quickly pivoted towards an election about the orange boogeyman south of the border and his claims on turning Canada into the 51st state. Now, I personally feel as though those kinds of concerns, those existential concerns about Trump and the United States absorbing Canada, are privileged concerns and not real threats. I think it's a little bit hyperbolic, as Mr. T is apt to do. Um, I think most of the people that I talk to are more concerned about issues related to what I just mentioned: cost of living, housing crisis, crime, inflation, young families being able to buy a home, young people being able to secure employment. And these are younger people's issues, younger people's concerns. However, the vast majority, the voting bloc, happens to be, and I'm looking at my stats here in Canada, and this is from Stats Canada. In Canada at the moment, the Liberal voters primarily are an older cohort. So most of the folks that voted for the Liberal government are aged 55 plus, and who tends to vote? People that are aged 55 plus. So the majority of support for the Liberals was the baby boomer generation. And I think the reason why this is the case is because the baby boomers especially in Canada, have a very anxious and fraught relationship with the United States. I think from especially for me growing up, we always prided ourselves on not being Americans more than we prided ourselves on being Canadians. And I think that that kind of attitude has continued over the years, and especially in the older generation who remembers a time when it was, it was nice to kind of live on this pedestal and always look down on Americans. And I think that sentiment has continued, whereas the younger generation doesn't really have that sensibility. I think their concerns are not so much about differentiating themselves from Americans, more so than it is, like I said, I think they are concerned about their future. They're concerned about climate change. They're concerned about the cost of living. And but that wasn't really the issue during this current election. So that's just one example of how the baby boomers kind of have a very significant position of power and influence in our country, mainly because they hold a lot of uh, sway in the elections and in a lot of our major institutions.
Yeah, it's well said. And I think it mirrors more or less what's more, I think, exactly the case here in the United States. When they look at the polls, they showed that the reason why Trump won was because for the first time, all of the young voters, shifted towards the right. And so it just left the older demographic to support the liberal side in the liberal cause, which I've more or less aligned with institutionalism. And to unpack that a little bit, there's a lot of great ideas that came out of the baby boomer generation in the 1960s and 70s, in particular, and a lot of those ideas and ideals made their way into sort of legislative bodies and into what I consider to be institutional mandates that more or less been trying to implement these values through society as a whole. And I think, as a young person, I'm a millennial. As a young person, I can say it's just not working for us. We're these different institutions and their rules have sort of gone AWOL in regards to the population as a whole. And you can really feel that. You can feel that through the housing crisis. You can feel that through the cost of education, the migrant crisis. So many things that I feel like are at least loosely attributed to, if not directly correlated to the baby boomer generation, who have consolidated power in Washington and held it since around 1995, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's to no great surprise in my mind that, at least in the United States, with a pretty strong rhetoric to break the status quo and the centralist forms of government and move more to the right, was a direct backlash to the systems that just aren't working for folks in this country. And I think, to a certain extent, all of our great Western nations, whether they be Europe, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, are all kind of facing the same post-war generational dilemma of consolidated power that's just not passing the baton, or is essentially exhibiting a cult of individualism that's destroying social solidarity in a sense that they're not reinvigorating the generations that are coming up behind them. And part of it may be longevity and uh, qualitative health, as a result of advanced technologies and advances in medicine. And so, where before maybe a generation would have slowly or more quickly withered away, we're just being we're in the shadow, a larger and larger shadow of a generation that seems to hold on strong and could be there for another 15, 20 years.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well said. Excellent. Yeah, they are a finicky bunch for sure. Yeah, no, going back to this idea of the institutions, just to bring it back to on the ground experience on my end. Yeah, I can relate. I've worked with a couple of organizations over the years, and I feel it from my age, the baby boomers were just that generation above. And again, this is just from my experience and talking to other people. Yeah, there is this sense that, and I can understand that they have this very hard work ethic. I mean, it's fair to say that baby boomers did build a lot of things, and we're definitely a generation that still used their hands, and they certainly built uh, a lot of the infrastructure that I currently am fortunate enough to use. So I'm grateful for that. But also at the same turn, there's a lot of this inability for that generation to kind of let go and pass on to the next generation below. And I think this has caused a lot of tension and a lot of friction, specifically between, I would say, like the Gen X generation and maybe the millennial generation more specifically, because I think it is the millennial generation that came in and had to work under the boomers, and were kind of subservient in some ways to that generation. Um, and I think that struggle, that tension, that divide is playing out currently everywhere we see it, especially as we spoke about with the immigration crisis. So for example, in Canada, since we do have an aging population, and again, going back to the stats, just quickly bring them up here, Stats Canada. When I look at the numbers, in Canada, we have children from ages 0 to 14 creates 16% of our population. The working age population of people that are 20 to 64 is 65% of our population. And then 65 and older is actually almost 20% of our population. And the average median age in Canada currently is 40.6 years. So we are certainly an aging population, and our fertility rates are low, along with a lot of like Western countries. And so who's going to care for all these older people, right? Like as these older people start to retire and need a lot of support, who are going to be like, where are we going to kind of pool uh, you know, workers to work these service jobs to care for these elder folks. And I think for Canada, our solution has been in the immigration realm. Our immigration numbers have almost doubled over the past 10 years per year. And but then again, where does that pressure go? It goes to housing because we do not have the housing or the infrastructure for this huge influx of people entering our country. And so who is most affected by that? It's not the single, widow who's living in a three-bedroom home who's 75 years old and is living on a pension and the house is paid off. It's the 21-year-old or the 25-year-old that's living in their parents' basement and can't really afford to even enter or even think about entering the housing market. So I think these tensions are real. And I think until there's some kind of a reckoning with that, which maybe that's what we're experiencing, it's only going to continue to create more anxiety with the young and this inability to let go with the old.
Yeah, well said. Exactly. It's a really big issue, and not to mention the downward pressure on wages that immigration poses to the existing workforce, specifically in America, where we have not seen a meaningful rise in wages to track inflation and cost of housing and goods, et cetera. And a lot of that's, in my opinion, the result of keeping wages low by um, diluting the workforce with a large number of migrant workers that come across the border. And this isn't to disparage their opportunities or, sort of the benefits of migrant labor. It's just to show that the sheer size and influx of help crossing the border as a result, to some extent, perhaps relatable to the aging demographic of the baby boomer generation. You know, there's a direct correlation there between need and appeasement in the migration numbers. It is really interesting. I mean, I think when we look at housing, for instance, which, you know, at the moment, the housing crisis in the United States, it's split between two camps, YIMBY and NIMBY. And the NIMBY generally, is a Karen, a person who's like picky about what color you might paint your house, or if you left the lights on too long or whatever. That's like the definition of a NIMBY in the most severe sense. And a YIMBY in the most severe sense is somebody that's essentially, yeah, hawking, or what's the term for it? Essentially the mouthpiece for corporate America building more housing. And if you're not familiar with those terms, NIMBY means not in my backyard, and YIMBY means yes in my backyard. And so like there's these two oppositional groups, and this is kind of how I kind of see all the conflicts in our countries, where it's they're fighting and distracting from the true cause, or one of the true causes, which is a cultural crisis. The cultural crisis is such that our most prized and most sensible locations are currently occupied by and large, by an aging demographic who are incredibly comfortable in their massive homes, living completely alone, while there's another demographic up and coming, the future of essentially this country and the world, who can't find housing and who are forced into small apartments on the edge of town. And so it's a really interesting situation that we're in right now. And of course, it's going to be hard to draw that parallel directly to the baby boomers through and through. I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of dynamics. But as we were discussing last week, or was it the week before, it felt pretty evident to me because, speaking from experience on the block in which I live, half of the households are occupied by widowed ladies, and we're in downtown Bozeman. And this is more or less pretty evident through most of the neighborhoods in downtown Bozeman. They're not seeing a lot of change or growth. And a lot of that can be attributed to an aging demographic that's just not moving on. So, and by moving on, I mean downsizing, moving to elderly communities or assisted living facilities or whatever. I mean, you can, there's a number of things that people can do, but instead they insist on staying in these large homes are very energy intensive and need a lot of maintenance. And so there's a lot of deferred maintenance. And also, what's happening is just this massive push to add more housing to the outskirts of the city, and exacerbating the trend from, I would argue again, the baby boomers moving to the suburbs. So it's a really, and then putting more reliance on cars and stretching the infrastructure even larger, and that maybe goes back to the psychology of plenty. Like, we grew up in an era of plenty and lots of opulence and abundance without any real foresight about limited resources and the end of growth. And instead of consolidating and building smart, they just sprawled, and here we are.
Yeah, the holy word progress. No, certainly. Yeah, the holy word progress. But I always ask, what are we progressing to exactly, for who, and for what? So it's a good thing to take a look at, especially in this country. I mean, again, we have a population of about 41 million people, and when 41 a population of 41 million people that is already seeing our major cities, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, some of the most expensive cities on the planet to live in, and we're bringing in, by numbers. Again, like you said, thank you for sharing that. It's not, by no means are we attributing this to folks that want to come to the United States or Canada to work and live. By no means are we negating the reality of that desire. I mean, we all come from families of immigrants, and we understand that push and that desire to live a better life. Yet I think it's up to the host country who's inviting you in to have proper housing and infrastructure set up for that kind of push. And I'll just compare right here in 2015, in terms of permanent residents admitted into Canada. In 2015, we let in 271,000. And in 2024, we let in almost double that at 450,000. So with those kinds of numbers of immigrants coming into this country, without the housing, the proper housing, for them, then that leads to tremendous tension. And we're already experiencing in this country, huge amounts of crime in our major cities. And this is just, back to the stats, this is true. I mean, my sister just actually, I didn't mention this to you before our call, Noah, but my sister just experienced a home invasion where they came into the house at night and stole the car keys from the kitchen table and stole their car. And this just
Wow.
happened last week in the Greater Toronto area. And this is the norm. This is happening on a regular basis. How home invasions, theft, crime, and when people are feeling the pinch, when they can't afford to live in a place or secure, um, secure employment, well, then it leads to crime. And over the past 10 years, we've seen in all of our major cities across Canada crime increase um, because of this, because folks are feeling that crunch. But who is more often not feeling this crunch are, and I'm not just trying to put this on the plate of the older generation, but I can say it's fair that older, wealthy people who are living comfortably when their home has doubled in value over the past few years, especially since 2020, they're not necessarily feeling that pinch, I would say. And so it's not as real to them. And this goes back to the election here in Canada, where the issues that I know a lot of my friends who are living in the cities in urban areas were concerned about, such as crime, such as a fentanyl overdose, which is running rampant in a lot of urban areas, such as the cost of living and rent. Older people living in suburban areas, like you said, these individual people living in three-bedroom homes in nice suburban areas are not feeling that pinch. And so for them, when they're thinking about voting, they're not thinking about voting for someone who's going to get really serious about crime or inflation or cost of living. They're more concerned about, like I said earlier, these issues such as being absorbed by the Americans, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And I never took that as a serious threat and serious concern. But Mr. Carney, who's our now prime minister, that was his whole platform, was basically saying, I'm going to fight Trump and we're a sovereign nation and we're not going to be taken up by the United States. And again, for me, I never seriously considered that a threat at all. But it's amazing how many people, especially where I live, who are, let's just call them white hairs, were concerned about that in a very serious way because they remember a time when these were concerns and not being American was definitely a very big concern. And so I think what are the next steps here? I mean, that's probably a question to start to kind of reflect upon. What are the next steps in this kind of situation with all this that we're talking about?
Yeah, and thank you. And I just want to, make sure that in case people get the wrong idea from listening to it, we're not, I don't think there's any correlation between, like migration and crime in like the strict sense that people are coming here and committing crimes. I think the data is pretty serious about that not necessarily being the case, but one could say that the destabilization of the social contract, promotes a surge in uh, perhaps desperation or drug use or crime as a result of resource scarcity or poor planning or whatnot. And it's definitely the case here in the United States as well. It's interesting to think about like what it looks like to turn the page. Are other generations more suitable to take on these problems? I don't know if I really want to entertain this idea that we're not going to fall on our sword once we're in power. I think that, inevitably each generation's going to bring boon and each generation's going to bring doom to some degree. And I think that's fair. However, we are kind of under siege for the first time by a generation due to the progress in technology and longevity in medicine, you know, for a much longer period than previous generations have endured. So there would be a much more fluid handover of power and influence and wealth, which would invigorate subsequent generations to bring their vision essentially and their inspiration and their truths and to the table and that's by and large being denied to us uh, by the fact that the majority of people that are in power have aged significantly. And so I think like what turning the page looks like for me, as far as what are the solutions, I don't really want to entertain what we could do better, but I do want to entertain more philosophically what it means to empower a generation that instinctively is looking for opportunities to give themselves a future versus power being in the hands of people that are instinctively looking to protect themselves and looking to isolate themselves in their last final moments, which I think can be attributed to human nature. I mean, it makes sense that when you're old and comfortable, the last thing you want is to feel uncomfortable and uncertain, right? So there's this protective mechanism. But when you're young, you have this dynamic sense of can do, and you're born with a vision for what you would like to experience and how you would like to enter the world. And I think that that has been more or less hijacked to a certain extent by longevity and by a huge generation casting its shadow over everyone else, and our grass just isn't growing. And so I think there's some arguments to be made as to, you know, perhaps how anecdotally in my life, and Angela, you've shared in your life, where we've been part of not institutions, but part of organizations that we care deeply about, that were very much in the death throes and clasped hands of the baby boomer generation, unwilling to allow change, meaningful change, to infiltrate and reinvigorate. That's my argument for all this. Like, all the stats and everything may be what it is, but the real problem is the lack of reinvigorating our societies, our cultures, our families with a fresh, new sense of can do. And that's where we're kind of stuck. And so I only see optimism. I only see growth. I only see, spring flowers and, fresh green buds as a result of new generations forging forward, and what that will eventually look like and how that will sour, eventually. None of us have a crystal ball to predict, but looking at nature as an inspiration for how society should operate is that the leaves and the deadfall of old and existing trees reinvigorate the up and coming seedlings, and we're seeing just a lack of that entropy funneling new growth, and that's kind of how I feel at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Yeah, well said, my friend. Yeah, it's interesting because I feel very similar to you. I mean, I work with young people, and there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of potential, certainly there for the younger generation. Um, and I think what I'm also dismayed by, and again, this is not unique to the baby boomer generation, but I think going back to, like, the 90s, and since the mid 90s to today, there has been a lot of, climate doomsday, which has not helped the conversation. And again, I'm not by any means denying that the climate change narrative by any means. I live in an area that's kind of overrun by forest fires every summer. I know you down there in Montana too. It's part of your summer reality. So we are, directly affected by the changing climate. So I'm not saying that it's not something we shouldn't be focusing on. However, to this kind of doomsday apocalyptic scenario that's being pushed on the younger generation does not help to give them a sense of hope and vision for the future. So that's one thing. I think kind of shifting our emphasis from just kind of being helpless to these concerns, to a more empowered approach. I think a lot of young people are finding more of an empowered approach. But I cannot help but share my frustration of a major event that just took place a few years ago, which was COVID. And I think if there's anything that I am in some ways ashamed of, is how, specifically in my country, the emphasis of concern was given to the old, uh, to the detriment of the young. And
Yeah.
I have never in my lifetime experienced a situation where the population, 55 plus, was the priority in many ways over the younger generation. And I saw this with schools being shut down for up to 2 years in this country. And what does that do to a younger generation when they're locked up in their homes, can't go to school, can't spend time with their friends? Um, I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole that we can go down, but I think it's important to speak on it because it does shine a light on, again, this inability to prioritize or give credence and attention to the emerging generation, as opposed to this continual grasp and hold um, from the older generation. And I think that is going to lead to many unhealthy things down the road. So I just wanted to speak on that. And in terms of the organizational thing, yeah, I from my own experience living here, I've worked with groups that that are held primarily by boomers, and just the frustration I've had in my time with trying to negotiate some kind of generational passing of the torch was just wrought with so much red tape, so much just yeah, so much inconsistencies and incompetence and fear, and that doesn't bode well. And one final note, what ends up happening then, I think, and this is something we talked about a couple weeks ago, is there's no coincidence that there is this rise in more of a right wing coalition amongst the young because they feel they're angry. They're getting angry. And so, where does that anger get channeled, especially amongst young men, young working men, is it gets channeled into these kinds of, rhetorical, uh, right side of the spectrum movements. And there's a fellow that you shared with me, a popular online right-wing presence. What's his name? The guy that does those debates. I think he was
Yeah, I'm
talking.
faltering right now. What is his name?
Anyways,
We'll
he's a yeah, we can look him up. He's a right-wing figure who is very much on that side of the spectrum, the political spectrum, and he
Charlie
had an
Kirk.
Charlie Kirk. Yeah, he was interviewed
Gavin
by Gavin
Newsom.
Newsom, and it was a perfect example. You have Gavin, who's maybe more of a like Gen X almost figure, maybe kind of Gen X boomer, you know, cusp there, having a long 2 hour conversation with a very young, he's in his 20s, very articulate, didn't go to college, and is very proud of that. And he lays out some pretty hard truths. And I've seen some other footage of him since we spoke, and he has a huge following, and he challenges the kind of the left wing intellectual class narrative and the institutional class narrative. And I think a lot of young people find solace in that because there are a lot of young people who are angry and for good reason. Like I just said, what happened during COVID. That's one specific reason. I think also the cost of living, cost of tuition, and also just this whole doomsday thing that's being thrown on them. And there is this feeling of unempoweredness, like there's nothing we can do. And I think young people are starting to realize, well, there's a lot we can do to channel that energy. And I just hope that it's, again, nothing against folks that are more on the right side of the spectrum, but I think ideally, I hope that energy is channeled in a positive way towards positive change. But what we're seeing right now is a shift towards figures like that, and I'm not surprised as to why that's the case.
Yeah, yeah. That he's Charlie Kirk's a really interesting guy. I have to say he looks a little bit like Tucker Carlson, and he has this sort of strange ultra right Christian demeanor that yeah, it gets under my skin a little bit, but I do appreciate his ability to engage in strong rhetoric and to come up with fresh ideas and thoughts to challenge sort of the cesspool of the status quo, really. I feel like for the first time in a decade, I've been able to like my thinking gears have been given oxygen, so to speak. And that's not because anybody's right in any absolute sense, but because people are just engaging the old narrative with fresh energy, fresh conversation, and regardless of whether it's right or wrong, that's not what we're here for. It's about continuing to engage, continuing to think critically, continuing to reevaluate the status quo. And that's invigorating. And I think there's a lot of young people that are like they can feel that because it's more of a feeling that the feeling of life returning to your body, that the feeling of vitality cresting again in your mind, and has less to do with being uh, statistically correct or being acknowledged as uh, politically correct, so to speak, right? It has more to do with just being like allowing the flow of intellectualism to navigate all corridors, even ones that have been deemed off limits by the institutional culture that we're in. And yeah, I mean, COVID was an absolute disaster. It was a disaster for young people. It was a total blow for the millennial generation. I mean, you had the 2008 recession, coming right out of college, 2008, right? You get back on your feet, and you're moving along, and then before you know it, boom, COVID hits, and the prices of houses triple, right? So right when you're thinking about home ownership, you get hosed there too. So it does feel to a certain extent like some sort of intergenerational cannibalism, right? Like the game's rigged to favor the people that are in charge. And that would be fine in to some extent, natural even, if there was a time limit to that, but there isn't. And like again, I really blame longevity and advancements in medicine um, to the fact that we might not actually see real meaningful intergenerational change for another decade as a result of this. And yeah, you know, personally, I've also been involved in several organizations who've seen dwindling numbers of young participants and have asked me as one of the few young participants, what can we do? What is it that we can do to make our organization more relevant? And every year I would go back and I would tell them the same story. This is what you do. And more than all of it had to do with just letting go of the reins a little bit, stepping aside as being in control to being a mentor, which is, I believe, to be a much more noble position than being the person that's has a death grip on the direction of everything, is being somebody that with wisdom that retires into a seat of confidant. And but no, every year the numbers are dwindling, and now they're you know moving into an and yeah, steep decline, so to speak. And it's disheartening to see that happening, and I'm curious if when we get older, if we're going to exhibit the same pattern of blind rightness that we insist on to insist that we're old and we've aged and we have the moral superiority and the wealth, and so it's our turn. I'm curious because I fundamentally believe in uh well, let me run this back. Again, I said this before. I think that the boomer generation represents one of the most fierce individualistic generations the planet's ever seen. And I think with that fierce individualism, you start to lose touch with the interconnected nature of reality, right? And so we can see that happening already in the 90s when, scientific evidence of climate change was real and we could have made meaningful policies to say, yes, it's scary, it's dangerous, but we are charting in the right direction. And, it's just being neglected. And so this fierce individualism that has lost touch with the interrelated nature of all things, you know, is sort of on a collision course where it doesn't see the imperative nature of rising generations being the answer and the solution to their existential anxieties, right? Because it's, you almost see that in plant life. You have one generation of plants that experience a stress, and that stress creates an adaptation, evolutionarily speaking, that gets passed down to the seed and or into this, fruit and seed, and subsequently, you have this slow acclimatation to the new threats. And I believe subsequent generations are the answer to that. Now, should they have unlimited resources and unrestricted access to power to exercise that? I don't think that that's how that works, but I do believe to a certain extent that, you know, the baby boomers are not irrelevant. They're massively relevant. Their life experience is important, but do they need to be in charge, or can they start moving to more mentorship roles where they guide up and coming generations in roles of power? Or should it go from, being in power to being dead, and then they're not really being a guidance system, and then the next generation kind of takes the reins without having been an apprentice, so to speak, to the boomers? I don't know. It's a really convoluted and large philosophical argument, but I'm going to be steadfast in the idea that I feel that our generation, our opportunities to a certain extent has been plundered by this form of modern, for the lack of better words, progress.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I've watched, again, to go back to the organization I'm speaking of more specifically here where I live. I've seen that organization pretty much deteriorate into what it is now, which is it's held by a handful of, quote unquote elders who have turned the once thriving, you know, um, community there into essentially a seniors home. And the young people that do end up coming to work on the land or be part of the organization are subservient and almost there to serve the, the older folks. Um, and I've seen that slow decline. So it's a decline that says, well, instead of us keeping this organization relevant, like you said, you know, inspired, with a vision and hiring or bringing in competent people, energetically young people to help move this organization forward, there's just this more of we're gonna instead continue to be at the reins and guide this organization ahead, and slowly over time just give up on any sense of continuation or growth or vitality. I mean, what is going to happen when these maybe handful of elders that are all now in their 70s, what is going to happen, like you said, a decade from now? That organization is probably just going to shut up its doors. And there's another layer to it because it is a pretty large property. And again, like you shared earlier about the NIMBYs who don't necessarily want, or the single person living in a three-bedroom home who's in their 70s and doesn't really want to share their room and space. I mean, the property there is 60 plus acres. Talk about an opportunity to build tiny little village, whether it be of tiny homes or tiny structures or, housing accommodations for folks who are struggling here where I live to find the right housing. But no, that's not even a conversation. It's not even an option. It's 60 acres for five elders to be living on, which is absolutely in my mind absurd. So again, it's just this idea of lack of an infusion of passing over to the next generation, having a vision, trusting that the younger folks have a plan and have a vision and can see a way forward. But there's just no real conversation in that area. So it has definitely frustrated me over the years, because, as I said, I've been involved with a couple of groups and organizations with this kind of mentality, which is stifling and uninspired, and it leaves me just feeling very helpless. And if I'm feeling hopeless and I'm in my 40s, I can only imagine what folks in their 20s must be feeling, probably even more, just absolutely at a loss as to what to do. Because you're speaking of the millennials who were hit by that 2008 crisis and then the 2020 crisis. I'm thinking about the 10-year-olds in 2020 that are now teenagers and basically almost lost a huge portion of their childhood, having to stare at screens and like homeschooled and lost out on sporting act like I mean it was absurd what happened. I mean sporting activities outdoors for kids were canceled. I mean it's just the absurdity of that is mind blowing. And I think the mental health rise over those years, the addiction rise, the suicide rates all correlate to an increase during those years amongst the young. So and again going back to this fellow Charlie Kirk who has this huge following, and again I see why. I see why in Canada, where the Conservatives, for the first time in history, the majority of support for the Conservative Party in Canada was amongst the 18 to 35 year olds. I mean, it's no surprise, right? It's no surprise there. So, yeah, I'm curious though on your from your side of the border because you live in the States. Do you correlate this popularity of this kind of Trump movement? Because it is becoming more and more of a youthful movement. It's not like a movement of old people, this MAGA movement. It's more and more becoming a movement of the young. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts from that side of the border, what you see there.
Yeah, great. Oof. With what a large issue to unpack. And
Do your
you
best, man.
know,
No pressure.
right. And I mean, it's like I said, I attribute sort of this rote institutionalism on the left that, in my opinion, became completely perverse. I mean, you know, I'm just gonna say it because I feel more and more comfortable with just being like, hey, these are the facts that I have, and this is where I stand right now. I think, allowing men and women's sports is one of those perverse turns of our society. I never quite understood like how twisted does somebody's thinking need to get to a point where that's the outcome, right? And there's so many creative solutions, but that's the outcome. It's a binary outcome, right? It's this predictable institutionalism that's trying to level the field, it's trying to be dynamic, and it cannot. Liberalism used to be dynamic, right? Like it used to be, uh, it used to be a real movement of the people, and it used to really mean something, and it's just become calcified and stiff, and I think dead. I dare say dead. As a result, you have these. I was telling Selena yesterday, like one of the things that I keep seeing about the left is they keep trying to graft these new apple varieties on a dead apple tree, you know, and they're surprised that nothing's growing out of it, or that, you get this, Frankenstein's creation. And I feel like that's, in my mind, really what's happening on the left. And young people aren't stupid. Young people are less ruled by their heads and more ruled by their bodies, because that's just kind of when you're vibrant and young, it's where you are. You're deeply centered in your body. And like I said, when I heard Charlie Kirk, and I hear other, conservative speakers, and let's say I just don't agree with them through and through, but when I hear them speak, I do feel a rise inside my body that says there's something here. There's something here. The other narratives, the old narratives, the institutional narratives of the left, have always felt constraining. They rule by fear and domination and control instead of through invitation and inspiration. And I think there is a level of invitation and inspiration, on the right as opposed to on the left. And of course, you go far enough right, and we're back in trouble again. But there is sort of a sense of plasticity that young folks feel. Well, the left just isn't working. maybe I'll have more movement or momentum on the right to exercise my, you know, reality. And I mean, it's super complicated and hard to pin down exactly why the right was a beneficiary. But part of, I listened to this really interesting interview, and I'm having a hard time recalling exactly who it was, but it was in regards to how communism after World War II pretty much snuffed out any opportunity for there to be a far left campaign. I mean, the idea of socialism and communism is the negative connotations with those ideas have more or less snuffed out any meaningful opportunity for there to be a far left party to bring in to affect some of the more radical ideologies that I believe a lot of people that move to the right in incorporated into their ideologies. And so without a meaningful far left, you have this far right. And so if there's a dynamic sense of movement, like where does life thrive? It thrives with space, thrives with freedom. There was a lot more of that on the far right than there was on the centrist left. And so you had a lot of people that, in my opinion, in this country, a lot of young people that are fed up with the status quo who said, okay, this doesn't make sense anymore. Well, there's no alternative except far left or far right. And for better or worse, now you're grouping yourself with extreme religious, groups, uh, xenophobia. There's some racism. There's a lot of traditional fixed mindsets on that side that, sort of have a tendency to pollute the water hole of what otherwise could be noble and good ideas. And so for the time being, they're going to be the beneficiaries of the young people, and who knows, maybe there will be a far left or a new political group that divorces itself sort of from the, archaic and static, religious centered and extreme conservative, uh, racial and xenophobic tendencies, and isolates itself more with forging a new path that is centered in something that is uniquely itself. And that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. And I think we both are on the same page with not, just being open to hearing what is on offer. What are the conversations that are being had, whether right or left or whatever. Like not getting caught up so much in these kinds of distinctions, but really just asking ourselves, like, where's the conversation happening? The honest conversation, the engaging conversation. And we both agree that it tends to be happening with these conservative movements where there is more of a kind of genuine willingness to really talk about things and have robust dialogue and debate. Not so polished, not so manicured, not so yeah, we were talking about how even this new, not so new, maybe it's been around for a while now, but the podcast form, it's just like long form conversation, unedited, uncensored, and letting people simply share their ideas and talk. And this is definitely something that has been dominated by the conservative side of the conversation. Um, and the liberal side has tended to be a little bit slower on the catch up, to adapt and adopt these kinds. We're seeing it now, certainly over the past few years, but for the longest time, it was primarily a lot of conservative thinking, conservative minded folks that were having these long form conversations. So I hope there is a rejuvenation and a bit more energy and excitement when it comes to the left side of the situation. But yeah, perhaps we can find an opportunity here to think about where do we take this conversation as we come to a close. We started off talking about how, this theme of all roads lead to the baby boomers. Um, and I think we've talked really well on our own personal relationship to that trend and movement, and both our optimism, but also our concern, especially with the younger generation, about this. And so I know, for example, up here in Canada, there's going to be a course correction. there's going to be a reckoning. We've just had 10 years of liberal rule, and we just elected liberals once again for another 4-year term, which is, potentially 14 years of liberal rule is absolutely unheard of in this country, and I think does not bode well. I think we definitely do need a course correction for better or worse to move away from these policies that have kind of put a stranglehold on um, any real conversation around, like I said, all the things I've listed. It's like everything's been put on hold now. All the conversations around the housing, around cost of living, around inflation, these things are all put on hold because there's this emphasis on U.S. Canada relations. It's become just top of mind, and the mainstream media has just covered it nonstop for months now. Um, and so, yeah, I'm trying to just maybe create an opportunity for us to close this conversation. And I think from my perspective, there needs to be a reckoning, and this needs to happen. And I think it's going to happen here in the next few years. I think you guys are ahead of the curve on this. You're kind of in the midst, perhaps, of your reckoning, for better or worse. And I know a lot of people are up in arms about what's been happening south of the border, but I'm actually watching, very intrigued by this, because I think it's an opportunity for interesting new things to take place. I think when there is this conflict and tension and crisis, it's an opportunity. Whereas we've tried our very best up here to avoid that crisis, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an internal crisis on the horizon very soon. So, yeah, any final thoughts and words from your end, my friend, on terms of what you're living down there south of the border, what you're seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean it's it's hard to say, right? 'Cause any major shift can certainly all of a sudden turn all of that upside down. But as it stands, our country has, the United States has an incredible level of debt, and interest rates are high. The uh, college is expensive, houses are expensive. Any there's no easy path to freedom, right? And defining freedom is kind of murky, but let's just say movement is freedom, right? And movement means being able to move through time and space with the minimal amount of restrictions on your time and space. And it's been severely handicapped, essentially, in my opinion, by and large, by a generation that's sought to benefit itself at the cost of other generations, the baby boomer generation. Now, not exclusively, obviously, it seems to be a trend amongst humans in general, but one could lay this at the feet of the baby boomers at this point. I don't know what the path forward looks like for the United States of America because of the tension in movement. It is hard to do all of the things that were cheap and easy in the 60s and 70s and maybe even the 80s. It's hard to go to college and come out without an incredible level of debt. It's hard to get a house without knowing that you're going to be slaving away until 70, paying 30 or more percent of your income. It's hard to imagine if there's even going to be Social Security or Medicaid, or sorry, Medicare rather, when we get older. All of these systems are in flux, and our level of hope as a result of it has been dampened. And I think that's why the right came out strong. And there's a little bit of at least some movement in ideologies and in evaluating the status quo. And from that might spring, who knows what's going to come out of that. But it literally was or is the only movement we have right now, is our movement to sit and ponder and evaluate our source code, meaning our social contract and what to expect. And if we can rewrite that or pressure test it in a way that ensures that subsequent generations have more opportunity or a more predictable trajectory towards exercising their intrinsic need to exist through their humanness, then all the better. But right now, whether you're in Canada, in my opinion, or in America, I think we're experiencing a high level of entropy, either through the status quo or through just disruption. We haven't yet charted course or had any meaningful insight into a new direction that will revitalize our cultures and our well-being. And instead, we're putting all of our eggs in the basket of, and this is a conversation for another time, artificial intelligence, robots, etc. And I think it comes as a great disservice to humanity and to younger generations that are truly the hope of the future because they are the future. The future is an inseparable part of them, right? Whereas, like with baby boomers, death is an inseparable part of their future, right? And in that, that becomes their motive if they're acting out of self-preservation and fear instead of out of understanding the cyclical nature of life and challenging that sort of fatalistic understanding of their future with bravery and courage. Instead, they're holding on to dear life for what little they have left. And it's really a sad, sad ending, in my opinion. So that's, I don't know, it's not a very optimistic ending for our podcast. But
No,
but
it's
it
good.
it's telling. It's telling. This is all I can squeeze out of this moment. And I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts as far as Canada or, any generational trend or rise that you feel optimistic about that could eventually surface.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good reflection that you offer. It's not necessarily, you know, a good or bad. It is what it is, and I think a lot of us are feeling the sting of this. I think this is something that the path has been laid out. I always think of there's a poet, I'm not recalling their name right now, but he always speaks of this image of the wake. And I was recently on a ferry and I was standing on the back of the ship. And looking out the back of the ship, I saw the wake of the ship. It's the ripple effect that the ship leaves on the water. And it's what's left behind after this giant vessel has moved across this fluid, you know, um, substance. And I could not help but think about that in terms of what we're talking about. And there's no coincidence, I guess, in the Irish tradition, when someone passes away, they go to that person's wake. And it's the same word, the same origins, because there's, people gathering up to talk about this person who they've lost, and it's really those conversations that are going to be the wake of that person. And so I think about all the actions I take in my lifetime, all the things I've done or haven't done, all the things I've said will leave a wake behind me. And I'm very aware of that and conscious of that as best as I can be, because I know that my actions in this lifetime will have an effect on those coming behind. And so, yeah, I just would maybe leave with that image of what kind of wake is being left behind, because there will be a wake for better or worse. Because when our ships glide across the ocean of our lives, we will leave a ripple effect, and I just hope that older generations, including myself, leave a wake that is of use and is useful for the generations coming behind. That's all I can that's all I can hope for, I guess.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
beautiful image, and it sounds like more like a play on words that we're going from woke to wake, from from woke up to wake up.
yeah, exactly. Woke maybe, it's interesting. It does have a past tense energy to it, the word woke, whereas
Yes, it does.
wake is very present and very timely to the now. And yeah, we've had our chance to woke up. Now it's our time perhaps to wake up and really, yeah, focus on what matters. And, there has been so much focus on things such as, again, uh, not to take away from the importance of certain issues such as, men and female sports and all this kind of stuff. I mean, these are concerns to a certain extent, but this is like in the grand scheme of things, we got bigger fish to fry. And yeah, I think now's the time to get down to it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I love it. And I love that last image of what what will be the wake, that we leave our children and grandchildren in as we depart this world. It will be a wake of desperation and fear, or a wake of love and kindness and wisdom. And I think that each one of us is going to have to make that determination and infuse it into our actions and yeah, into what we leave behind.
Hmm. Well said. Well said, my friend. Well, I think on that note, we'll leave. Yeah, we'll leave the conversation for now and pick it up again next month. But yeah, thank you, my friend. Always great to talk and share and connect. And yeah, reminding folks once again, we are a couple of friends that have been talking for over a decade now, and over the past few months, we've decided to start to record these conversations, and we're sharing what we're sharing. It's coming from a place of wanting to, again, try our very best to understand what's going on in our current reality as best we can, and hopefully you get some solace from it. Um, yeah, thank you, Noah.
Yeah, thank you, Angelo. And looking forward to our next topic, which is still undecided for next month.
Yes, as am I, my friend, for sure. Thank you all for listening. If you did like this conversation, please go ahead, follow, share, do all the things to spread the word. We always love the encouragement and the support, or leave your feedback, thoughts, reflections. We'd love to hear from it. But till next time, enjoy, have a great day. And yeah, Noah, see you next time, my friend. Have a good one.
You too. Take care, everyone.